Welcome to the Jay-Z Show. This is our second edition. It's Zafar Sobhan speaking from Dhaka, Bangladesh, and I'm joined by Jon Danilowicz. I know you're in the US, John. Where exactly are you coming in from today?
So I'm coming in from my home, which is just outside Boston, Massachusetts.
Okay, just outside Boston, Massachusetts. And John, I wanted to start off this discussion by getting your thoughts, your reflections on the last week. I think you were just in Bangladesh. You were on a trip here. You had attended some conferences, some symposiums. I know you've met with a lot of people and really taken the temperature of Bangladesh at this very crucial moment in our history. So I wanted to get a little bit of your feedback, a little bit of your thoughts as to how you found Bangladesh compared to when you last were here, it was, I believe, some months ago in March, and what do you see as the trajectory of Bangladesh in the last 12 months or so since the uprising and the ouster of the Sheikh Hasina government?
Sure, thanks. So I just returned day before yesterday after a very brief visit to Bangladesh. I was on the ground for less than a week. It was my second visit since March, and or my last visit was in March. My second visit in 10 years, really. And it was very useful to look at a broad range of topics. I mean, first of all, I was there to attend, as you mentioned, a conference celebrating or marking the 1-year anniversary of the July Revolution. So that was a very emotional moment to be at Dhaka University, to interact with a number of those who participated in last year's uprising, and to assess where we were a year later. So that was the reason for my visit, and that was a primary focus. While I was there, of course, news was beginning to break of some of the developments on the road to elections. So there was reporting on consensus being reached within the Consensus Commission, and since I've returned, further details have emerged about what the July Charter may look like. Also, it's widely anticipated that Professor Yunus will soon make an announcement about the timing of elections, with most people anticipating that he'll formalize elections taking place in the first part of February, as he signaled when he met with Tariff. Another topic which I was personally very focused on was the whole issue of transitional justice, in particular the importance of truth and healing. I went in looking also at the issue of potential reconciliation between those who had supported the previous regime and those who had struggled against it. We can perhaps talk about that more later, but on that regard, my conclusion is that while truth and healing need to happen, we're still some ways off from reconciliation. And then finally, as always, I spoke a bit about Bangladesh-United States relations, and there was a particular focus and interest on the tariff negotiations. At the time, there was quite a bit of anxiety about what the negotiations would result in, with the August 1st deadline looming. And we all woke up this morning with the news that the US and Bangladesh had reached an agreement, and the Trump administration has announced a new tariff rate for Bangladesh.
That's right. I mean, I think I'm here in Bangladesh. I just missed you. I was out of the country when you were in, but we all woke up to this news, and I think most people are feeling very gratified, quite relieved, and they think that this certainly has to be counted as a victory, as a diplomatic victory for the interim government. They were under a lot of pressure, they were under a lot of scrutiny, and they did face a considerable amount of criticism from various corners in terms of how the negotiations were being conducted, especially when the provisional amount of 37% was announced, I think, some time ago. That led to a lot of discontent, dissatisfaction. A lot of dissenting voices were raised as to how this negotiation was going through. And of course, at the same time, and this is an interesting point for you and I to address, at the same time, it also led to people feeling discontent vis-a-vis the United States, that they said, well, how is this, what does this say about the Bangladesh-US relationship? What does this say about America's relationship with the world in general? And, how do we expect America to conduct itself, in this second Trump administration? So I think a lot of these concerns have been laid to rest by the announcement of 20% this morning. It seems a very competitive amount, and it also seems, I think, crucially, that there was give and take, that the American side sat down and they listened to what the Bangladeshi side had to say, and then they acted accordingly. And I think for Bangladeshis, the main thing is it's not so much the amount of the tariff in isolation. It has much more to do with what are the tariffs which are being levied on countries which are in a similar situation to Bangladesh. And for us, that is countries which, largely export garments to the United States. So we're talking Vietnam, we're talking Cambodia, we're talking India. And I think, again, when you look at it from that perspective, we have got a fairly positive response and a fairly positive result. What are your thoughts on that, John?
No, I'm largely in agreement with your analysis. I often consider myself these days as an outside insider. I have 30 plus years of experience working inside the US government, but for the past 4 years, I've been on the outside looking in, but still with a reference to how I remember things from the inside. So if I look at the trajectory of US-Bangladesh relations over the last year, the United States under the Biden administration moved quickly to embrace the results of August 5th and then August 8th with the formation of the interim government. Not surprisingly, the interim government and the Biden administration enjoyed a cordial, warm relationship, and there were a number of specific areas in which the U.S. moved to support the reform effort and the road to elections. There was a lot of anxiety, I don't have to tell you, in Dhaka about what a Trump inauguration would mean for U.S.-Bangladesh relations, and many foresaw a downturn in relations perhaps influenced by the U.S. relationship with India. Early on, I advised people not to panic, that there were ways in which U.S. Interests in Bangladesh and Bangladeshi interests would coincide. And I advised people to be patient, to keep calm. I was very pleased to see that from the beginning, as early as February, the interim government, under the leadership of the National Security Advisor, Dr. Khalilur Rahman, moved to engage with the United States to understand what had changed in Washington, to understand the Trump administration's priorities, and then began to build a foundation for what came to fruition yesterday. So even when the first letters came out in April announcing the 37% tariff rate, the government of Bangladesh didn't panic. It continued to negotiate in good faith with the United States. And this carried through July, with the second letter being issued by the administration showing a small decrease. Again, there was a lot of panic as August 1st was approaching. But I think the government of Bangladesh understood that at a political level, it was important to signal to the Trump administration a willingness to work with the United States to address the United States' concerns, while at the same time safeguarding Bangladesh's interests. The negotiations continued and ultimately reached the state yesterday where President Trump and the White House was able to announce this new agreement, leaving Bangladesh in a relatively strong position compared to its main competitors, and allaying those concerns and uncertainty which had been a cloud hanging over the relationship. From, again, my ex-insider perspective, knowing how U.S. officials interact with foreign counterparts, all of the vibes from the U.S. side, whether it be from U.S. officials in Dhaka or in Washington, were very positive toward Bangladesh, the administration, and the Bangladesh government negotiating team. So I think it's not a surprise to those who are watching it closely that we reached this positive outcome. But again, many in Bangladesh and those who don't necessarily wish to see this interim government succeed, I think we're just chomping at the bit to be able to have another reason to criticize them. And in that, I think they'll find themselves disappointed, even though Bangladesh as a whole, I think, has a lot to celebrate.
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of those people who were prophesying doom and gloom were doing so rather gleefully. It wasn't really a prophecy so much as it was a wish dressed up as analysis. And a lot of analysis, of course, is that. You kind of want something to happen and you hope that you can kind of make it happen by prophesying that it will happen, or you can at least move the dial a little bit in that direction. I think what I have noticed is two things, and I think this ties in very well with what you have said. I think it's very important to also look at the tone and the vibe of negotiations. You see, I think these are as important actually as the result. And one of the things I have noticed is I think the Americans and Bangladeshi, both sides, do actually feel that the other side is the side they can do business with. This is not going to be the only negotiation between our two countries moving forward in the future on various issues. And so I think what has been established is a good working relationship, a sense that we're on the same side here, a sense that we both have partners, who are sensitive to what each country's specific needs are and each country's specific interests are and limitations are as well. And, what are the political angles, the political limitations and ramifications of decisions made on both sides. I think that's actually an underplayed part of it. And I think that's a lot of what I've sort of understood in terms of talking to people behind the scenes as to why there was, at least within the government, no panic. Because they said, well, look, we're having these good discussions. And when I talked to people sort of at the US Embassy, and they said, no, absolutely, the tone has been very, very good. And so that's the first thing. I think the second thing, which is very key, is one of the things which we had been concerned about post November, after Trump had become president for the second time, was that we would move back to a situation where Bangladesh would be viewed, the Bangladesh-American relationship would be viewed through an Indian lens, and India would be, again, given primacy in the region. And I think it's very clear, not just in terms of trade, but also strategically, it's very clear that that is not a direction this current administration is moving in, that they very much understand that Bangladesh is an independent country, is an independent player, and needs to be engaged with very much directly and very much as its own thing, rather than part of a different discussion with another country. I think that has also come through very clearly, and I think that was something which was, very specific. That's a very specific concern people had. And I think this also, and if you also, it's not just if you look at this, the tariff amount, if you look at the rhetoric which is coming out of the United States vis-a-vis Bangladesh, the rhetoric coming out of the United States vis-a-vis India, I think certainly vis-a-vis Bangladesh has been quite respectful. It has been very much a recognition of Bangladesh as a sovereign, independent, proud nation, an important country, a country which America needs to develop its own separate relationship and engagement with. I mean, that's what's come through to me. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, to understand fully the success that Bangladesh had, one only has to look at the tortured negotiations between the U.S. and India that you alluded to, where I think from the Indian side, they just didn't get it. They approached these negotiations as they had trade negotiations in the past, with a very detailed technical approach, which I think misread how the Trump administration was approaching this. By contrast, I think similarly to Bangladesh, Pakistan understood that the needs of the moment were to signal to the United States a willingness to partner, a willingness to respond to U.S. priorities. Coming back to Bangladesh, I think there's some important lessons here, not just for the interim government, but for future governments. One of, I think, the real risks in a bullet that was dodged at this moment was for the political opposition to pile on. Again, as I noted, there were a lot of criticism from individuals, but fortunately, as a party, neither the Bangladesh Nationalist Party or any of the other major parties took a strong stand against the interim government or against the trade agreement. One of the things that I reminded people in private was that everyone in Bangladesh would benefit if an agreement were reached, and everyone would suffer if they didn't. And those who were critical of the Yunus administration or the interim government's approach never were able to give a compelling argument of how or why they would have done better. Certainly, one could foresee what might have happened had a Awami League government still been in power. And there's no reason to believe that an Awami League government would have done better than the interim government did. And even looking forward, if, as many people assume, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party forms the next government, at this point, there's no reason to believe that they would have necessarily done better. And again, on the issue of vibes and predicting how U.S.-Bangladesh relations will evolve over the coming year, one of the real question marks is what is the team that the next government will put in place, whether it's the BNP or another party. One of the advantages that the interim government had, particularly again with Dr. Khalil leading the effort, was that he knew Washington well, he knew the United States well, and even though his role in Bangladesh has evolved, and again he's been subject to criticism, in my view he was the right person in the right place at the right time to lead this effort.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question. I think in the past, the BNP has signaled that they would be interested in having an inclusive government. They have mentioned having a national government, bringing in people and experts and people from other political parties even. I'm not sure, you see, of course, the negotiations are constantly a moving target, so I'm not sure if that's still on the table. What was on the table last week is often not on the table next week. But if that is something which they're serious about, I think that would be, in fact, a really good thing to see. And I'm not sure, whether we'd see any holdovers from this government. Perhaps not. Certainly, holdovers from the cabinet. But certainly, if we could get people of that caliber, you know. Either as technocrat ministers or from other political parties who are not necessarily just from the BNP. And of course, the BNP has very capable individuals who I could think of playing a similar role. And I think, sort of on that count, when you look at I think one of the key things for an incoming government is if we look at one of the very high performers of this current administration has been Ehsan Manzoor as the governor of Bangladesh Bank. And of course, he will have, I think, a year and a half or 2 years left of his tenure, even after the election. So I think a big part of the continuing success of whatever reform process and we have seen in the financial sector is linked to him staying on as Bangladesh Bank governor. So I think whoever does come to power, I would hope that would be their first order of business. And of course, I think for a man of his conviction and his stature, the way you convince him to stay is you have to guarantee him a free hand, which of course, once upon a time, Bangladesh Bank governors did have a free hand and they did operate fairly independently. And as a result, our sort of macroeconomic stability in the country for a long time was very good. We have to understand the problems we're facing in Bangladesh, in our banking sector, in our financial sector, in terms of currency, in terms of foreign currency reserves, are relatively recent. And that had to do with a lot of misgovernance and a lot of mismanagement in the bank in the last few years of the Hasina government. That is not something, for the most part, prior to that, things had been governed fairly well, and hopefully now they're being governed well, and hopefully that'll continue in the future. I wanted to ask you a little bit, John, about, of course, there's a lot of concern inside the country, outside the country, how we are going to navigate the final few yards of this reform in transition to election process. You'd mentioned the issue of transitional justice, and I do want to come to that. Sort of, I think we can finish off our conversation looking at that. But before we talk about transitional justice, let's talk a little bit about just the transition process. And do you think is your sense from what you found talking to people on the ground that we are moving towards elections on time, that there's sufficient that there will be a sufficient amount of reforms and there'll be a sufficient amount of compromise between the various parties that will bring us to where we need to get to in the next 6 to 8 months?
Thanks. So if the announcement takes place as we expect on the 5th of August or thereabouts, that elections will take place in February, that gives the interim government about 6 more months. My understanding is the last 45 days or so of that period will be the formal campaign. So then that very much limits how much time the interim government has left really to focus on broader governance issues. So we're definitely entering the home stretch. One of the things that struck me reflecting on my visit was the disconnect between how I was seeing the situation and how many of my Bangladeshi friends and interlocutors were. I remarked to one very close friend of many years that I seemed that we were living in parallel universes. That he continued to be very skeptical, very negative about the prospects, and feared that despite these positive signs, that there were still troubled waters ahead. On the other hand, for me, I took kind of an Occam's razor approach. There's a broad consensus, I think, that the interim government's tenure should expire in that February period. Nobody's presented a credible argument for why elections should take place later. And moreover, I don't see anyone who has sufficient strength within the political process to compel others to go along with that. And on the reform side, which in many ways was much trickier, I think the Consensus Commission deserves credit for finally having found a way to bring those discussions to a conclusion. I think the idea of televising those deliberations in great part has been a positive one. And I think the mechanism whereby consensus has been defined, Individual parties have been given their opt-out or their dissent, and then the package has been able to be put together to then be presented and ultimately, given to the parties to implement, with the people acting as a watch guard. So to me, the path forward is pretty clear. And even on something like the trade issue that we were talking about, there's only so much governments can do. For example, in building the US-Bangladesh economic relationship, it's up to the private sectors. And I know that the private sector is looking forward to elections and an elected government because of the increased certainty that that will provide. So again, from my perspective, all of the stakeholders share an interest in seeing this government make it to the finish line, see the reform process go as far as it can during this period, and then continue. Now, the spoilers who are outside, who want to turn the clock back, are a minority, and we can talk about them. But I left Bangladesh very optimistic about the path forward. I'd be interested, though, again, since we didn't have the chance to sit down and talk in Dhaka, how do you see the current situation moving?
I think I, in general, agree with you in that I think there's much less to these divisions and these problems than meets the eye. I think part of the problem is those of us here in Bangladesh, we are incurably skeptical and pessimistic. And of course, one of the things which I always use as an analogy, and it gives me a little more confidence in the process, is that if you ever were to walk into a newsroom at 11:30 at night, and someone were to tell you that a newspaper is going to be published at midnight, you'd say impossible. The scene is of such chaos, of such absolute madness, that you say there's no way on earth that that you're going to get everything done in the next half hour. But of course, somehow everything is done, and it doesn't seem like it's going to happen, but it does happen. I figure that is kind of the way the situation is right now. So I do understand when people are looking at things objectively and it looks in complete chaos, it looks as though there's so much distance between the various parties. Where is the room for compromise? Where is the consensus going to come? But I think, somehow we will muddle through to some kind of a solution. And I think the main reason is, as you have alluded to, I think all of the major stakeholders are really committed. No one really wants to, stay in power. And I think a key part of this is I don't think Professor Yunus himself has any desire or any wish to stay in power any longer than he absolutely has to ensure an orderly transition. I think a lot of the people who are thinking that maybe, the interim government is going to stay or there will not be elections, it comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of who he is and a fundamental misunderstanding of what his ambitions are. And of course, that's it's understandable as well, because a lot of people, they look at other people through their own eyes and they think, well, if I was in power, I wouldn't let it go. But I don't think that's what's motivating Professor Yunus. And I think that is a huge part of why I am quite certain that we will have elections on time. And I think also if you look at other key constituencies, who are influential, who maybe have a disproportionate influence compared to their numbers. If you look at the business community, I think they're all ready for elections as well. And of course, by and large, if you look at the polling which is done by the Bangladeshi people, they are ready. They are ready for elections. In fact, one last poll, which was conducted several months ago, suggested, this was conducted in March, I think around the same time you were here, that the majority of people, or plurality of people, would have been happy to have elections by June or August. And a very clear majority wanted elections by December, because I think that's the way the questioning was done. So December didn't happen. But I think really, and you have to understand, June was always the outside edge of when elections were. That had been signaled by a number of parties, and I think people would have really lost they would have lost patience had it dragged on longer. So I think February makes a lot of sense if it happens, and I think the relevant parties have signaled that there's no reason that can't happen. I think in terms of reform, we have to accept that there's going to be a slightly less ambitious reform agenda. And ultimately, I think at the end of the day, and if you also look back at what happened in 2007, 2008, really at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter that much what any interim or transitional government puts in place. The ball has to be picked up by the incoming political government. And a lot of the reforms we're talking about are not even reforms which an incoming government can do. We're talking reforms over 5, 10, 15 years. It's a continuing process. So it's a real mindset change which we're talking about. So I think let's not expect to be too much to be concluded and handed over by the time elections take place. And I think a lot of focus has been placed on that, and people thinking, well, if that's not going to happen, then where are we? I think everyone has to just have that confidence that, we've set the ball in motion, and you have to have good faith in the political actors, good faith in the rest of us to make sure that they remain honest when they come to power, and that we'll then move the reform ball forward. We'll move the process forward. It isn't something that can actually be accomplished in a year or 18 months. It's an ongoing thing. So I am also in agreement with you. I mean, I've noticed one thing about this conversation, John, is that I fear we're in agreement far too often. We need to really, in future episodes, we have to come up with points of difference, okay? Because if people are going to tune into the two of us agreeing on everything, how's it going to be? But on that subject, let's move to I think we have time for a final topic, which let's talk a little bit about transitional justice. Let's talk a little bit about the legal situation which pertains here in Bangladesh, which and I think probably I would have to say, if you were to ask me what is where I expected more from the interim government and hoped for more, and think that perhaps that some of the things they have done have not moved in the right direction. It's along these lines. What are your thoughts on that when you look at the many people behind bars, a lot of the fairly tendentious cases which have been placed on them, and the fact that a lot of this looks very much, to the outsider at least, or to the casual observer, like the politics or the justice of revenge, rather than trying to set up a functional, fair, impartial judicial system.
Right. So obviously there's a lot that needs to be done in the justice sector. And I would commend to everyone the recent Human Rights Watch report, which highlights some of these challenges and concerns that you pointed out. On the broader issues of transitional justice, there's a focus on the importance of accountability. And for many, that's limited really to the formal judicial process involving the former prime minister and others who are accused of directly being responsible for the crimes that were committed, not just last July and August, but over the preceding 15 years. As the trials get underway, I think we'll all have to watch very closely to see if the ICT process can live up to the high standards that the international community expects, and I think that many in Bangladesh would expect as well. Beyond the formal accountability process, though, I think there's a broader set of issues, and those are the ones I really focused on. I'll confess I came to Bangladesh very much focused on the issue of reconciliation, how you stitch society back together. What do you do about those supporters of the previous regime, maybe those who don't have that same level of responsibility for crimes, yet otherwise are somehow seen as being tainted or having supported or enabled the regime, many of whom are in prison, frankly, many of whom are friends of mine. I thought there might be perhaps time for a reconciliation process to begin with them coming forward and being met by their victims and having some kind of process to lead to reconciliation. One of my takeaways from my visit is that it's far too early to talk about that from both sides. I think those who were the victims, their emotions are still too raw and they're not yet ready to forgive. And for complicated political reasons, those who are accused of crimes and those who are associated with the former regime don't yet feel that they're in a position to ask for forgiveness. So if you take those issues aside, what are you left with? You're left with something which I think doesn't get enough attention, and it's the needs of the victims of those crimes, not just their physical needs, but their emotional, their psychological needs. There hasn't been enough done, in my view, to assist them. Well, there's been a lot of focus, for example, on the martyrs of July and August of last year. Very little, if anything, has been done for the victims or the survivors of the enforced disappearances, for example. There's been a commission that's begun to take testimony on some of those crimes, but there have been no formal ways in which those victims have been made whole. There have been some efforts at memorialization, but more needs to be done. So again, I think there needs to be a broader consensus within society on how to move forward in coming to grips with what happened in that period. And, back to the issues of transition, this is something that won't be completed by February. It will have to continue beyond that. So I hope as the campaign begins and elections approach, all of the parties will be very explicit in how they approach these issues and what, will happen going forward.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to understand that a lot of people, we're not just talking about the events of July and up till August 5th, the 36 days of last year. There were a lot of human rights violations, a lot of extrajudicial assassinations, people who suffered very, very greatly at the hands of the last regime over the last 15 years. And we should not also forget them and not forget their sacrifice and what they have been through. So when we're talking about justice, when we're talking about people finding justice for crimes against them, we have to take the long sweep of history. It's not just the July uprising, which of course that is the most egregious and really utterly sort of appalling example of the excesses of the last regime. But it's important to acknowledge and realize that that there was a process which built up to this over the last 15 years. I think for me, the interim government has missed a trick in terms of not setting up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or really moving forward in that direction. I read what you say that maybe it's too early, but I'm kind of a if you build it, they will come kind of person. I think oftentimes when you start something before it's the time to start it, that helps bring about the process. And I actually think it could have been done. I suspect it wasn't done for political reasons. And I think that was also perhaps an error of judgment, because my sense is, as you alluded to, that the people who were part or of the ruling party or seem to be complicit in their crimes, they are at this stage, for whatever reason, unlikely to come forward. I think it's too early for them. However, had the government set up this process and no one had come forward, at least the government could then say, well, we've done our bit. We've started the process. It may now take time for people to come forward and become a part of this, but then no one can point fingers at the government for not having taken that first step. I do also think that there has to be some kind of understanding. I think, that there's a very broad brush. Of course, people who have been directly involved in atrocities, who have been directly are complicit in, quite heinous crimes. That is something which does need to be they do need to be brought to justice. I think what we're seeing, however, is a lot of people with fairly indirect complicity, or if complicity at all, or fairly indirect connections with the former regime who are now being targeted. And I wonder how helpful that is. I've always said that, when it comes to reform, the one reform which I think is truly important in Bangladesh, we're not really talking about this as a problem of the last 15 years. If we're honest, this is a problem which Bangladesh has been steeped in since our inception, since the very start, from sort of January 1972 onwards, is been the desire to sort of, to crush one's political enemies into the dust. And this is something which, honestly, every government in Bangladesh, to a greater or lesser extent, has been guilty of. And every opposition, who are oftentimes in happy incarnations, part of the government, have suffered from. And I feel as long as that continues, then we'll always be at war with ourselves, because, there are just simply too many people on either side of the political aisle for you to really, for any one side to be able to really wipe the other side off the face of the earth, which, honestly, both sides have tried to do it and both sides have failed. And I don't think it is possible to succeed. And ultimately, the more you try and succeed, the more fractured and divided our society is going to be. So I think the real thing, and I'm very, I'm bullish on Bangladesh. I always have been. I've been here for the last 22 years, and made my life here, raised my family here, and I do believe that our better days are ahead, and I think so much good is happening. But what I would like to see, and I think what is so important for Bangladesh, is to actually move towards a situation where people don't have to feel that there are winners and losers, or that it's a life and death situation every time there's an election or every time there's a change of government. And I think until we get to that stage, we're always going to be at war with one another. So I would like to see more done. And I agree with you. I think it's going to take time. None of this happens overnight. And there are some things which are not forgivable. There are some things which people will not be able to get beyond. And I understand that as well. It's easy for me sitting here in my comfortable studio having not suffered directly or having no one of my family suffer directly at the hands of the last regime, to say such a thing. And I get that as well. Nevertheless, I do think that's a direction we need to move in as a country.
No, well said. I endorse all of your sentiments, and we'll see some of these competing narratives play out over the next 2 weeks as the nation marks the anniversary of August 5th, and then those associated with the previous government mark their own anniversaries later this month.
Okay, absolutely. And John, on that note, I think we'll bring this second episode to a close. It's always a pleasure talking to you. For those of you tuning in, I hope you find this interesting. I hope you find this informative. And I hope you'll join us again 2 weeks from now, where we'll have more interesting things to talk about. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John.